He came to the mountains to outrun a memory of water and a choice he could never forgive. The memory was cold, a crushing weight of black liquid and the fading grip of a hand he was ordered to release. He had followed the order. He always followed orders. It was the one thing left in him that worked without flaw. But the mountains, with their stoic silence and their indifference to human regret, offered a different kind of discipline. Here, the only orders came from the shifting of the sun and the turning of the seasons. Elias Vance had hoped that would be enough. He hoped the silence would be vast enough to drown out the echoes. The truck, a machine as worn and functional as he was, labored up the final gravel switchback. Below him, the valley floor opened up, a sight both alien and biblical. For nearly 100 years, this had been Lake Silas, a deep, cold reservoir held in place by a monumental dam. But the dam was old, its concrete bones weary, and for the first time since the 1930s, its gates had been opened. The water had been bled out downstream for a year of repairs, and the lake was gone. What remained was a basin of cracked, drying mud, a vast, empty bowl under the autumn sky, scarred with the ghostly channels of forgotten streams. It was a landscape of exposure, a place stripped to its truth. Elias felt a grim kinship with it. He parked near a stand of skeletal pines that had once marked the high water line. Before he cut the engine, he looked at his partner in the passenger seat. Bear, a German shepherd of indeterminate age, sat with the rigid posture of a professional. His muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and his dark eyes missed nothing. He was not a pet. He was, like Elias, a veteran. They had shared heat, dust, and the thin, humming air of places best forgotten. Bear had been his early warning system, his anchor, his silent confessor. The dog's breathing was the only sound in the cab, a slow, steady rhythm that had paced Elias through more sleepless nights than he could count. Elias killed the engine. The sudden quiet pressed in, thick and absolute. This was what he had come for. A silence so profound it had teeth. He opened his door, and the air that met him was crisp and carried the scent of pine and something else, the damp, ancient smell of mud and decay, the smell of a world that had been held under water for a lifetime. He swung his legs out, his worn leather boots meeting the gravel with a familiar crunch. He was a tall man, lean but dense with the kind of muscle that comes not from vanity but from years of carrying heavy things over long distances. He moved with an economy that bordered on stillness. He wore what he always wore: dark cargo pants, a faded plaid flannel shirt, and an olive M65 field jacket that had molded to his frame. It was a uniform of self-imposed exile. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked with relentless precision, a stark contrast to the timeless landscape. He pulled his backpack from the bed of the truck, an Eberly stock half-track, its pockets and straps arranged with a practiced, methodical neatness. Every item had its place. Every piece of gear was a known quantity. Control, in a life that had spun out of it, was found in these small rituals. Bear hopped down from the truck, landing with a soft thud. He didn't bound or explore. He stood beside Elias, his head up, nostrils working, reading the story of the valley on the wind. He was assessing, measuring, never entirely off-duty. Elias watched him for a long moment. The dog's presence was a physical weight, a grounding force. It was a communication that required no words, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger. Elias trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own. His own had failed him at the most critical juncture. They made their way down the gentle slope toward the edge of the immense mudflat. The ground transitioned from pine needles and rock to a spongy, dark earth that gave way under his boots. The scale of the drained lake was breathtaking. From here, he could see the entire basin, miles across, cupped in the hands of the granite peaks. The sun, low in the afternoon sky, cast long, distorted shadows that made the cracked mud look like the skin of some ancient, slumbering creature. A single dirt track, probably used by the dam workers, snaked its way toward the concrete monolith at the far end of the valley. Otherwise, there was no sign of human life. "Well," Elias murmured, the sound swallowed by the emptiness. "This is it." Bear made no reply, but his tail gave a single, slow thump against Elias's leg. It was an acknowledgement. "I am here." That was all that needed to be said. They would make camp here, on the firm ground just above the muck, and they would watch the days pass. They would listen to the silence. Elias would try to forget the sound of the water. He set up his small one-man tent with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 other nights. He unrolled his sleeping bag, arranged his small stove, and filtered water from a canteen. Every action was deliberate, a meditation in motion. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, a chill crept into the air. The valley floor grew darker, its features dissolving into an ocean of shadow. It was then that Bear first acted strangely. He was sitting at Elias's side, watching the valley as if it were a tactical problem. Suddenly his posture changed. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but Elias knew it instantly. The dog's back stiffened, his head cocked, and his ears, which had been relaxed, swiveled forward, locked onto a specific point deep in the basin. A low, almost inaudible huff of air escaped his nostrils. It wasn't a growl. It was a sound of intense, focused curiosity, of something being wrong. Elias went still, his hand resting on the dog's neck. "What is it, boy?" He scanned the valley, his eyes tracing the line of Bear's gaze. He saw nothing. Only the endless expanse of mud, the deepening shadows, the faint silver line of a creek that was recarving its old path through the silt. There was no movement, no light, no sound. But Bear remained rigid, a statue of focused intent. He was locked onto something a mile away, something Elias's senses couldn't begin to detect. The hair on Elias's arms prickled. He had learned long ago that if Bear said there was something there was something there. The initial sense of peace he had sought began to fray at the edges, replaced by the old, familiar hum of vigilance. The mountain, it seemed, was not as silent as he had hoped. The night passed in a deep, star-dusted quiet, but Elias slept only in short, fitful bursts. The image of Bear's rigid focus was burned into his mind. He woke before dawn to a world steeped in cold mist. The valley was a sea of gray, the far peaks invisible. He made coffee on his small stove, the hiss of the flame a lonely sound in the immense stillness. Bear sat beside him, patient, but his gaze kept returning to the same spot in the valley below. The unease of the previous night had solidified into a cold knot in Elias's stomach. After a sparse breakfast of oatmeal, Elias cleaned his gear and packed a small day pack. Water, a medical kit, a compass, a length of rope. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to go. To ignore Bear's instinct would be a betrayal of the highest order. It would be like ignoring the compass in his own pack. He clipped a long lead onto Bear's collar, a formality more than a necessity, and they started down the slope. The mud was worse than he'd expected. The top layer was a cracked, dry crust, but underneath it was a thick, greedy ooze that sucked at his boots with every step. It was slow, laborious going. The air was heavy with the smell of a century of submerged life now exposed to the air, a mix of wet earth, decaying vegetation, and something vaguely metallic. Elias moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes scanning the terrain, trying to see what Bear had seen. For an hour, they walked. The sun began to burn through the mist, and the valley floor steamed around them. The cracked mud stretched in every direction, a monotonous, alien desert. Elias was beginning to doubt, to wonder if the dog had simply been spooked by a shadow or a scent carried on a freak current of air. He was about to suggest they turn back, a thought communicated through a simple pressure on the lead, when Bear stopped. He didn't just stop. He went rigid, planting his feet in the sucking mud. The lead went taut in Elias's hand. The dog's entire being was focused on a spot about 20 yards ahead. His body was a straight, tense line from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. He let out that same low huff of air, a puff of controlled energy. "Easy," Elias said, his voice low. He slowed his own breathing, falling back into the old rhythms of approach. He scanned the area. It looked no different from the rest of the valley floor, a flat expanse of cracked, gray-brown mud. There were no tracks, no debris, nothing. Then Bear did something he rarely did without a command. He pulled, hard, and broke away from Elias, trotting directly to the spot that held his attention. He circled it once, his nose low to the ground, sniffing intently at the cracks in the dried earth. Then he stopped, lowered his head, and began to dig. Not frantically, but with a deliberate, purposeful motion, pushing aside chunks of dried mud with his powerful front paws. Elias walked over, his boots making squelching sounds in the mire. He stood over the dog, watching. Bear was digging with an unnerving focus, ignoring Elias completely. Mud flew, spattering his graying muzzle. After a few moments, his paws hit something with a dull, solid thud. It was not the sound of rock. It was a sound that had no business being here, buried in the middle of a lake bed. Bear stopped digging and looked up at Elias, his dark eyes intense. He had done his part. Now it was Elias's turn. Elias knelt, the cold mud seeping through the knees of his cargo pants. He pulled his folding knife from his pocket and used the blade to carefully scrape away the remaining mud from where the dog had been digging. The object was dark, covered in a slick film of algae and silt. As he cleared more of it, a shape began to emerge. It was a straight line, a perfect, man-made right angle. He scraped further, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He uncovered a flat surface, and then another line, running parallel to the first. It was a roof. He stood up slowly, wiping his muddy hands on his pants. He took a few steps back to get a better perspective. What Bear had found was the peak of a roofline, the dark, waterlogged shingles barely visible beneath their blanket of silt. It was the roof of a building, a cabin, perfectly preserved in the anaerobic gloom at the bottom of the lake. It had been here for nearly a century, a silent, submerged tomb. Awe warred with a creeping sense of trespass. This place was not meant to be seen. It was a secret the water had kept. He spent the next hour walking the perimeter, the shape of the structure becoming clearer as he paced it out. It was a small rectangular building, a simple cabin. The roof was pitched, and one side had a collapsed stone chimney, a pile of dark, moss-covered rocks. The rest of the structure was buried, its walls disappearing into the deep, consolidated mud. There was no obvious way in. No windows were visible, no porch, nothing but the dark, slick line of the roof. He circled it again, his trained eyes looking for any anomaly, any sign of an entrance. He found nothing. The mud had sealed it completely, creating a single solid mass. It was a fortress of silt. He was about to give up for the day, to head back to camp and think, when he noticed Bear again. The dog had moved. He was sitting a few yards away from the exposed roofline, along the cabin's longest wall. He was not digging this time. He was simply sitting, perfectly still, staring at a section of the buried wall that looked identical to all the rest. His posture was absolute. It was the same unwavering focus he used on a firing range when indicating a hidden explosive. It was a declaration. Here. Elias walked over and stood behind him. "The door?" he asked quietly. Bear didn't move, his gaze unwavering. Elias trusted the dog's senses over his own. Bear could smell the subtle differences in the wood, the fainter seal, the ghost of a frame. He knelt again, this time with a new sense of purpose. He took out his knife and began to dig into the dense, packed earth where Bear was indicating. It was slow, hard work. The mud was like clay, heavy and dense. He needed a shovel. He worked for 2 hours, carving away the mud with his small knife and his bare hands. He was covered in the cold, dark earth, but he didn't stop. Slowly, painstakingly, a shape began to emerge from the wall of silt. It was the faint, vertical outline of a door frame, and in the center of it, a dark, corroded shape of iron, a simple latch handle. Bear had been right. He had found the door. A cold thrill, part excitement and part dread, ran through Elias. He had found the way in. But the question remained, what had been locked away inside? Returning to the cabin the next morning, Elias carried a collapsible entrenching tool from his truck. The small shovel felt absurdly inadequate for the task, but it was better than his knife. The sun was higher today, the air warmer, and the mud around the cabin had begun to dry and crack even further, releasing a stronger scent of wet wood and stagnant water. Bear trotted ahead of him, leading the way back to the door he had found, his purpose clear and undiluted. Elias spent the morning in a rhythm of digging. The work was grueling, the silt was heavy, clinging to the shovel, and each shovelful felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But the physical labor was a balm. It focused his mind, silencing the intrusive whispers of memory. There was only the scrape of the shovel, the suck of the mud, and the steady, quiet presence of Bear, who sat watching him like a foreman, his head tilted with what Elias dryly interpreted as a judgmental air regarding his technique. Slowly, the entire door was revealed. It was made of thick, dark planks, swollen and warped by their long immersion, but miraculously intact. The iron latch was fused with rust. There was no breaking it. Elias studied the frame, looking for a weak point. The wood was soft. He wedged the edge of his shovel into the crack between the door and the frame and leaned into it with his full weight. The wood groaned, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the empty basin. It was the first sound this place had made in generations. He pushed again, muscles straining. There was a sharp crack, and the shovel bit deeper. He worked it back and forth, leveraging it, feeling the ancient wood fibers tear. With a final, agonizing shriek of tortured timber, the door gave way, swinging inward into the darkness. A wave of air washed over him, unbelievably cold and smelling of absolute stillness. It was the smell of time itself, of dust that had never been disturbed and water that had never moved. Elias stood at the threshold, his heart pounding. He pulled a powerful flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting a sharp white cone into the gloom. He swept the light across the interior. It was a single room, and it was like looking at a photograph from another century. Everything was coated in a fine, uniform layer of gray silt, softening every edge, muting every color. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. On the table sat a plate and a cup, as if someone had just finished a meal. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. In a corner, a simple bed frame with a rotted mattress sagged toward the floor. It was a scene of sudden interruption. A life stopped mid-motion. The water had come, and it had frozen this moment in time. Elias stepped inside, his boots sinking slightly into the silty floor. Bear followed at his heel, his claws making no sound. The dog moved with a kind of reverence, his nose twitching, reading the dense library of scents. Elias ran his light over the walls. He saw a shelf holding a small, neat stack of books, their covers swollen and illegible. He saw a set of faded photographs in simple wooden frames, the images themselves completely washed away, leaving only blank, ghostly rectangles. On a peg near the door hung a man's coat, its shape perfectly preserved, but the fabric was as delicate as ash. He reached out to touch it, and his fingers went right through it. This was more than an archaeological curiosity. This was a home, a life, and the way it was left suggested the owners had not departed willingly. There was a story here, a story of loss that resonated with the hollow spaces in his own soul. He knew he couldn't just walk away. The discovery had laid a claim on him. He needed to know what had happened. That afternoon, he drove the 30 miles to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Harmony Creek. It was a town that time seemed to have largely forgotten, with a single main street lined with brick buildings from the early 20th century. He found the county courthouse, a stern gray stone building with a tall white clock tower that was stopped at 3:15. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor polish. He found the county clerk's office. Behind a high wooden counter sat a woman who seemed as solid and enduring as the building itself. She was in her late 50s or early 60s, tall and spare, with sharp blue eyes and gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. A nameplate on the counter read, "Martha Thorne, County Clerk." She looked up from a large, leather-bound ledger as he approached, her expression neutral, cautious. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. "I hope so," Elias said. "I'm looking for old property records from before the Silas Dam was built." Martha Thorne's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Silas Hollow," she said, the name sounding strange and ancient on her tongue. "That's a deep dive. Most of those records are archived. What are you looking for specifically?" "A map, maybe? A list of the families who lived there." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his field jacket, the weariness in his eyes, the quiet intensity of his posture. "You one of the dam engineers?" "No," Elias said simply. "I'm just interested." His vagueness did not seem to satisfy her, but she nodded slowly, a decision made. "The official buyout records are in the state archives, but we might have the original plat maps." She disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of document boxes. Elias waited, the silence of the office broken only by the hum of a fluorescent light and the ghost of the stopped clock. She returned a few minutes later, blowing a layer of dust from a long, rolled-up tube of canvas. She carefully unrolled it on the wide counter. It was a hand-drawn map, dated 1928. In beautiful, spidery script, it detailed the valley then known as Silas Hollow. It showed the winding path of the creek, the forested hillsides, and dotted across the valley floor 24 small squares, each with a family name written beside it. Ames, Miller, Garrett, Vance. Elias froze. His finger hovered over the last name. Vance. It was the same as his. It was probably a coincidence, a common name. But seeing it there, on this map of a drowned world, sent a strange current through him. "Find what you were looking for?" Martha asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Maybe," Elias said, his voice tight. "Who would know more about these families? About what happened to them?" Martha Thorne pursed her lips. "The official story is they were all bought out fair and square by the utility company. a triumph of progress. But if you want the real story, or at least the one that gets whispered about, you need to talk to Arthur Finch. She gave him an address. He's our local historian, lives and breathes this stuff. Tell him Martha sent you. And, she added, her gaze softening just slightly, be careful out there on that lake bed. It's not a stable place. Arthur Finch lived in a small house overflowing with books. They were stacked on shelves, on tables, on the floor. The air smelled of aging paper and pipe tobacco. He was a small, bird-like man in his 70s with a halo of white hair and eyes that lit up with an almost manic energy when Elias explained what he had found. "A cabin," Arthur exclaimed, clapping his hands together. "Intact? Oh, that's magnificent. I always knew the official narrative was a lie." He spent the next hour talking, pulling books from shelves and spreading old sepia-toned photographs across his dining room table. He explained that Silas Hollow had been a tight-knit, self-sufficient community, mostly settled by veterans of the Great War and their families. They were homesteaders, people who wanted to be left alone. The dam project was pushed through by a big consortium out of the city, Arthur said, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Viridian Power, it was called then. They presented it as a marvel of modern engineering, bringing electricity to the whole region. The papers at the time painted the residents of the Hollow as backwards-thinking obstacles to progress. He tapped a faded newspaper clipping. They claimed every family took a generous buyout and relocated happily. But I've heard stories, passed down. Stories of intimidation, lowball offers made in the dead of winter, threats. Some people said a few families just refused to leave. But when the water came, the story was sealed. Until now. Arthur's words hung in the air. Intimidation. Refusal. Elias thought of the cabin, the plate on the table, the coat on the peg. A life interrupted. He thought of the name on the map. Vance. He drove back to the valley as the sun was setting, his mind racing. He felt like he had been given a mission. A purpose that had been lacking for so long. This was no longer just a discovery. It was a responsibility. Back at the cabin, under the cold light of his flashlight, he began a more methodical search. He had to know more. He ran his hands carefully over the silty surfaces, feeling for anything out of place. Near the bed, his fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular under a thin layer of mud. He carefully excavated it. It was a metal footlocker, rusted but solid. The latch was sealed tight. Using the pry bar on his entrenching tool, he worked at the lid. With a screech of tortured metal, it popped open. The inside was dry. The seal had held. And inside there was no treasure, no gold, no jewels. There was paper. At the top was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Elias opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, methodical handwriting. It was an account book. But it didn't track farm expenses. It tracked the buyout offers from Viridian Power. Next to each family name from the map was a number. The numbers were shockingly low. And next to some, in a different, scratchier ink, were notes. Refused. Offered 50% more. Still refused. M. Garrett threatened with eviction notice. Beneath the ledger was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and under that, a single tintype photograph in a brass frame. It showed a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, a woman with tired eyes holding a baby, and a young boy standing beside them. On the back, an inscription. The Garrett family, Silas Hollow, 1931. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air of the cabin. This was the family who had lived here. The Garretts. He flipped back through the ledger to their name. The last entry, dated in the winter of 1932, was stark. Final offer refused. Property condemned. Eviction pending. He sat back on his heels, the flashlight beam illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air.
This cabin wasn't just a home. It was a hold-down. It was the last stand of a family that refused to be washed away by progress. He looked again at the name on the map that had caught his eye. Vance. He remembered stories his grandfather, a combat engineer who had worked on dams all over the country in the 30s, used to tell. Vague stories about difficult jobs, about clearing land. He had never mentioned this valley by name, but the coincidence was a splinter in Elias's mind. Was it possible his own family had been connected to this, on the other side? The weight of the discovery settled on him. This ledger, these letters, this photograph. They were the evidence of a deep injustice, an 80-year-old crime covered by 100 feet of water. And now, he was its custodian. The silence he had sought in this valley was gone, replaced by the insistent whisper of a story that demanded to be told. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It was right here, in his hands. If the discovery of this forgotten history has stirred something in you, take a moment to honor it. The truth, like faith, often requires us to dig. Like, share, and leave a comment below about a time you uncovered something unexpected. Subscribe to so we can continue to explore these quiet miracles together. Sometimes the Lord asks us to stay and listen to the stories the earth remembers. The following day broke with a deceptive calm. Elias spent the morning carefully documenting everything in the cabin, taking photographs with his phone. He handled the ledger and the letters as if they were sacred texts, their brittle pages a testament to a forgotten defiance. He felt a profound connection to the Garrett family, to their stubborn refusal to be erased. It was a kind of courage he felt he had lost in himself. He was kneeling on the floor, examining the construction of the footlocker, when a sound from outside broke his concentration. It was the low, guttural growl that Bear reserved for a specific kind of threat. It wasn't the warning for an animal. It was for a man. Elias went instantly still, his hand moving to the hilt of the large knife on his belt. He rose slowly and moved to the doorway, peering out. A man was standing about 50 yards away, near the edge of the excavated area around the cabin. He was a stark anomaly in the desolate landscape. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, polished black shoes that were already smudged with mud, and a crisp white shirt. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that was both pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth. He held a sleek tablet in one hand. "Hello there," the man called out, his voice smooth and confident, carrying easily in the still air. "Quite a discovery you've made." Elias didn't answer. He stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself between the man and the entrance. Bear moved to his side, a low rumble still vibrating in his chest. The dog's body was a study in controlled aggression, a clear, unambiguous line drawn in the mud. The man in the suit began to walk toward them, picking his way carefully through the muck. He stopped a respectful distance away, his smile unwavering. "Julian Croft," he said, extending a hand and then letting it drop when Elias made no move to take it. "I'm with the Viridian Development Group. We own the dam and the surrounding lands." "Viridian Power," Elias said, the name tasting like rust. Croft's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "An ancestor of our current corporation, yes. We're overseeing the retrofitting project. I lead the land management division. We've been conducting geological surveys of the lake bed before it's refilled. Your excavation here showed up on our drone sweeps." "It's a historical site," Elias stated flatly. "Indeed. An interesting one," Croft agreed, his tone condescendingly patient.
A fascinating little relic. We'll have our archaeological team document it properly, of course, before the land is reclaimed. Reclaimed? Submerged again, Croft clarified, as if speaking to a child. The dam repairs are on a tight schedule. The valley will be underwater again by spring. This area is technically private property and, for safety reasons, off-limits to the public. The bureaucratic language was a smokescreen, and Elias saw right through it. They wanted to bury this place again, and this time for good. I found records, Elias said, his voice low and hard. A ledger. Letters. They tell a different story about how Viridian acquired this land. The mask of polite civility slipped. A flicker of genuine annoyance crossed Croft's face, before it was replaced by a look of magnanimous understanding. Ah, yes. Historical documents can be so easily taken out of context. The 1930s were a different time, with different methods. Viridian is, of course, prepared to make a significant donation to a historical society of your choice to commemorate the residents of the Hollow. And we would be happy to offer you a finder's fee, a consultancy payment for your troubles. Say, $50,000? For your discretion and your cooperation in allowing our teams to do their work unimpeded. It was a bribe, wrapped in the language of corporate responsibility. Croft was trying to buy the truth, to put a price on the Garrett family's defiance. The offer was an insult not just to their memory but to Elias himself. It assumed he was a man who could be bought. Maybe the man he used to be, the one who followed orders without question, could have been, but not the man standing in this valley. The truth isn't for sale, Elias said. Croft's smile vanished completely. His eyes went cold. Mister, I don't believe I caught your name. I didn't offer it. Look, Croft said, his voice taking on a hard, patronizing edge. You're a man who looks like he understands how the world works. This cabin, this truth you think you found. It's a footnote, a complication in a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project. It will not be allowed to stand in the way of progress. You can either be compensated for your time, or you can be removed for trespassing. The choice is yours. But I assure you, the outcome for the cabin will be the same. It was in that moment of unveiled threat that Bear made his judgment. The low rumble in his chest deepened into a clear, menacing growl. He took one step forward, planting himself firmly in front of Elias, and for the first time showed his teeth. It was not a wild display of aggression. It was a cold, precise, and utterly serious statement of intent. It was the final escalation before violence, a warning that any further advance would be met with force. Julian Croft, for all his tailored confidence, was not a fool. He took an involuntary step back, his eyes darting from the dog to Elias. The veneer of civilization had been stripped away, and he was looking at two veterans who understood threat in a way he never could. He saw the wolf beneath the sheepdog's wool. I see, Croft said, his voice tight with anger. He straightened his suit jacket, a pathetic attempt to regain his composure. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, and from the county sheriff. He turned and walked away, his polished shoes slipping and sliding in the mud, robbing his exit of any dignity. Elias watched him go, his hand resting on Bear's head. The dog's muscles were still coiled tight. The confrontation was over, for now. But the battle had just begun. Croft had made his intentions clear. He wasn't just going to let the water cover this secret again. He was going to actively destroy it. And Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was going to have to stop him. The quiet exile he had planned was over. He had been given a new post. He was the guardian of Silas Hollow now. Croft was true to his word. The next morning, a small convoy of trucks rumbled down the service road.
Elias watched them from his campsite on the ridge, a pair of binoculars pressed to his eyes. Croft was there, along with a crew of 4 other men. They weren't wearing suits. They were dressed in work gear, and they began unloading survey equipment, bright orange fencing, and tool crates. They were establishing a perimeter, a claim. One of the men stood out. He was younger than the others, with the ramrod posture and close-cropped hair of a former soldier. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was different from the others' clumsy civilian movements. While the rest of the crew joked and complained about the mud, he worked in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the area, including the ridge where Elias was watching. Their eyes met for a brief second across the distance. There was no hostility in the man's gaze, just a flat, professional assessment. Elias recognized the look. It was the look of a man doing a job he didn't necessarily believe in. Elias mentally tagged him. Sam. As Croft's crew worked, the sky began to change. The clear, crisp autumn blue was being swallowed by a bruised, purple-gray mass of clouds rolling in over the western peaks. The wind picked up, whipping across the lakebed in cold, sharp gusts, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. A storm was coming. A big one. The mountains seemed to hold their breath, the silence replaced by the sighing of the wind through the pines. Elias knew he had to move the records from the cabin. The ledger, the letters, the photograph. They were the heart of the story. The undeniable proof. He packed them carefully into a waterproof bag and stowed them safely in his truck. He then returned to the cabin, unwilling to abandon it completely. It felt like a dereliction of duty. He would stay. He would bear witness. By midday, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. Within minutes, it was a downpour, a torrential sheet of water that turned the valley into a gray, churning chaos. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at the tent and threatened to rip it from its moorings. The cracked mud of the lakebed dissolved into a slick, treacherous soup. Croft's crew, caught off guard by the storm's ferocity, scrambled to secure their equipment. Elias stood in the doorway of the Garrett's cabin, the rain lashing down around him. Bear was at his side, his body pressed against Elias's leg, a warm, solid presence in the maelstrom. The storm was a cleansing, a violent baptism washing away the surface layer of the world. But it was also a danger. He saw it happen in slow motion. A heavy piece of survey equipment, a tripod-mounted laser scanner, had been left on a muddy incline above the cabin. The rain-soaked ground gave way. The scanner, weighing several hundred pounds, began to slide, gathering momentum, a silver and black beast of metal and glass tumbling directly toward the cabin's fragile, century-old wall. Time seemed to slow down. Elias saw the trajectory. It was going to hit the wall right where he stood. His training screamed at him, get clear, preserve the self. But his heart screamed something else. He glanced down at Bear. The dog saw the danger too. But instead of retreating, Bear instinctively moved forward, planting his feet and barking, a futile, courageous attempt to ward off the inanimate threat, to protect his human. And in that split second, Elias was no longer in Silas Hollow. He was back in the cold, black water. The roar of a helicopter overhead, the weight of his gear pulling him down. He felt the grip of a hand, a friend's hand, slipping from his own. He heard the order in his headset. Leave him. Secure the asset. That's an order. And he remembered the sickening feeling of letting go, of choosing the mission over the man. The memory was so vivid it stole his breath. He looked at the sliding equipment. He looked at Bear. The asset was the cabin, the proof. The man was the dog at his side. The choice was the same. Mission or partner. Let the cabin take the hit and preserve the evidence inside, or save the one being who had stood by him through everything. This time, he would not let go. Bear, heel! He roared over the wind, but it was too late. The dog was committed. Without a second thought, Elias lunged. He threw his body into Bear's, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick torso and rolling, using his own momentum to carry them both away from the point of impact. They landed hard in the slick, deep mud, a tangle of limbs and wet fur. An instant later, the scanner smashed into the ground where they had been standing. It didn't hit the wall directly. It plowed into the mud at the base of the foundation with a sickening crunch of metal and earth. The impact sent a tremor through the ground. Elias pushed himself up, his body aching. His first thought was for Bear. "You okay, boy?" The dog shook himself, spattering mud everywhere, and licked Elias's face, his tail giving a few frantic thumps. He was fine. A wave of profound relief washed over Elias, so powerful it made him dizzy. He had made the right choice. He had chosen loyalty. In that single, instinctive act, a weight he hadn't even realized he was still carrying began to lift. The impact of the equipment hadn't destroyed the cabin, but it had done something else. It had shattered a section of the old stone foundation near the ground. The heavy scanner had acted like a battering ram, exposing a dark cavity beneath the floorboards. It was a hidden space, a cellar or a compartment that had been completely sealed. From across the site, through the sheets of rain, Elias saw the man he'd tagged as Sam watching them. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen Elias dive to save his dog. He saw him ignore the potential damage to the cabin. As Croft began shouting orders, trying to organize his panicked crew, Sam moved with purpose. He walked over to the temporary fence they had erected, and with his back to Croft, he deliberately unlatched one of the gates. Then, as he walked past a small communications unit, he fumbled, and a two-way radio dropped from his belt into a deep puddle of muddy water. He glanced at it, then at Elias. A quick, almost imperceptible nod before turning to help the others. It was a small act of defiance. An open door, a broken line of communication. He was giving Elias a chance. The tide had turned. The storm, the accident, the choice, the small act of rebellion from a stranger, it all combined into a single, clear path forward. Elias knew what he had to do. The night and the secret hidden in the cabin's foundation were his. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By morning, the sky was a scrubbed, brilliant blue. The air was clean and cold. The valley was transformed, glistening and wet, the ravages of the storm evident in the newly carved gullies and slick, treacherous mud. But in the aftermath, there was a profound stillness, a sense of a world washed clean. Elias had not slept. He had used the cover of night, the unlocked gate, and the chaos of the storm to his advantage. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, exposed by the sliding equipment, had been his focus. It was a small, stone-lined space, not a cellar, but a hiding place. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a tin box, was the Garrett family's true legacy. It wasn't just more letters. It was the original, unamended deed to their 160-acre homestead, a document that predated any of Viridian's claims. And with it was a sworn, handwritten confession. It was dated 1933 and signed by a low-level Viridian Power land agent, a young man consumed by guilt. He detailed in stark and simple prose the campaign of intimidation, the threats of violence, and the final, forced eviction of the Garrett family on a bitter winter night. He wrote of how they refused to leave, how the sheriff had been bought, and how the family had simply vanished after being taken from their home. They were good people, the confession ended. God forgive what we did in the name of progress. This was the smoking gun. This was not context. It was a crime. As the sun climbed higher, Julian Croft and his crew returned. They looked bedraggled and angry. Their expensive equipment was caked in mud. Croft's face was a mask of cold fury. He saw Elias standing near the cabin, waiting for him, and marched over, his pretense of civility completely gone. "You're finished here, Vance," Croft spat, finally using the name he must have looked up. "I have a court order. You're trespassing, and you are to be removed. My crew will then proceed with the demolition." "I don't think so," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying an unshakable weight. It was then that another vehicle appeared on the service road. Not a work truck, but a county sheriff's SUV. It pulled to a stop, and Martha Thorne stepped out of the passenger side. She was dressed in practical boots and a heavy coat, but she carried the same air of implacable authority she had in her office. With her were two sheriff's deputies and, to Elias's surprise, the elderly historian, Arthur Finch, who looked at the exposed cabin with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Croft's face went pale. "Clerk Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Mr. Croft," Martha said, her voice like chipping granite, "is that this is no longer a corporate survey site. As of an emergency declaration I filed an hour ago, this is now a protected county historical landmark and a potential crime scene." She held up a copy of the Garrett family's original deed, which Elias had given her when he had called her before dawn. "According to this document, which appears to be the legitimate title, your company's claim to this specific parcel of land is fraudulent." She then produced the confession. As she read excerpts from it aloud, Croft's composure finally shattered. The color drained from his face. His blustering threats, his corporate jargon, his talk of progress. It all evaporated, leaving only a small, defeated man stripped of his power. The deputies moved to his side, their presence a silent final statement. The battle was over. The truth, unearthed from the mud and defended through a storm, had won. As the authorities began securing the site, taping off the cabin with the reverence due a sacred place, another car pulled up. It was a simple sedan, out of place in the rugged valley. A woman got out. She was younger than Elias, with the same dark hair and a familiar, determined set to her jaw. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years, not since he had first retreated into his shell, pushing away everyone who tried to reach him. He had called her after he had called Martha, his voice tight and unfamiliar even to himself. He hadn't known what to say, so he had just told her where he was and what he had found. He hadn't expected her to come. She walked toward him, her steps hesitant. The distance between them was more than just physical. It was years of silence and shared, unspoken grief. "You called," she said, her voice soft. "I did," he replied. It was all they needed to say. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a simple, grounding touch. He didn't pull away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the ghost of the past, but a bridge to the future. It was a beginning. He turned his gaze back to the valley. The story of Silas Hollow would now be told. The Garretts would not be forgotten. Arthur Finch was already talking animatedly with the state official, his hands waving, his voice filled with a lifetime of vindicated passion. Later that day, Martha Thorne found Elias sitting with Bear on the ridge, watching the official activity below. "That was good work, Vance," she said, standing beside him. "What you did here, it mattered." "The dog found the door," he said, deflecting. "And you opened it," she countered. "The county is going to need someone to oversee this site, someone with your skills, someone who knows how to watch, how to protect things. It's not a big salary, but it's a post, a place to stay." Elias looked out at the valley, at the cabin resting in the mud, a small, defiant monument to integrity. A place to stay. For so long he had only been running, moving from one empty place to another. The thought of staying, of putting down roots in the very ground that held such a powerful story of holding on, felt radical. It felt right. He looked at Bear, who was resting his head on his knee. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the mountains, which no longer felt like a place to hide, but a place to stand guard. "I'll think about it," he said. But in his heart, he knew he had already made his decision. He was home. Weeks turned into months. The official work at the cabin site was slow and meticulous.
Archaeologists and historians came and went, carefully excavating and preserving the contents of the Garrett home. The story made regional news, a quiet tale of a forgotten injustice brought to light. Viridian Development, faced with a lawsuit from the state and a public relations nightmare, issued a formal apology and established a substantial fund for the preservation of the site and the creation of a memorial. Croft was gone, a casualty of his own hubris. Elias took the job. His official title was Site Warden. It was a simple role. He was the guardian of the valley. He lived in a small, county-provided cabin on the ridge, a solid little structure with a porch that overlooked the entire basin. He and Bear walked the perimeter every day, their quiet patrols a familiar rhythm against the backdrop of the mountains. The lake was slowly, inexorably beginning to return. The dam repairs were complete, and the gates were closed. The creek, which had reclaimed its ancient path, swelled and then disappeared as the water level began its steady climb. Elias watched the water rise, day by day, a slow blue tide creeping back up the valley walls. But this time, it felt different. It was not an act of erasure. The Garrett cabin was now protected. Engineers had constructed a subtle, permanent cofferdam around the site, an underwater enclosure that would preserve it in a pocket of air even when the lake was full. A series of memorial buoys would float on the surface directly above, marking the location, and a plaque on the shore would tell the story of Silas Hollow and the family that had refused to leave. The water was returning, but it would no longer hold the secret. It would simply stand guard alongside him. One crisp winter afternoon, Elias stood on his porch, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands. Sarah was visiting. Her visits had become a regular thing, awkward at first, but slowly settling into a comfortable, healing routine. They didn't talk much about the past. They didn't need to. They talked about the weather, the progress at the site, the stubbornness of old dogs. They were rebuilding, one quiet conversation at a time. Bear was lying at his feet, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, his eyes closed. He was dreaming, his legs twitching, probably chasing rabbits in a field he had never seen. Elias reached down and rested his hand on the dog's warm, solid back. The bond between them felt deeper than ever, forged anew in that moment of choice during the storm. He had chosen loyalty, and in doing so, he had saved himself. He looked out at the rising lake. The water was now halfway up the valley walls. The tip of the cabin's roof was gone, submerged once more. Soon, the entire site would be invisible, hidden again beneath the calm blue surface of Lake Silas. But it was not lost. It was at rest. It was remembered. The cold memory of black water and a slipping hand was still there. It would always be a part of him. But it no longer had the same power. It was no longer a drowning weight. It was a scar, a reminder of a lesson learned and finally applied. He had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about honoring it. It wasn't about running from the ghosts. It was about standing up for them. The sun began to set, casting a golden light across the surface of the water. The mountains stood in silent purple silhouette against the fading sky. Elias took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. He was not hiding here. He was watching. He was staying. And for the first time in a very long time,
He felt a sense of peace settle over him, as deep and as quiet as the water in the valley below. In the end, it wasn't about the cabin in the lake. It was about a man drowning in a silence of his own making.
Elias came to the valley seeking an escape, but God gave him a task. He was sent to stand guard over a forgotten promise. Today's story is a reminder that our deepest wounds are often the very places where we are called to serve. The past cannot be outrun, but it can be redeemed. It's redeemed in the quiet choice to stay, to protect, to honor the fallen, whether they fell in battle or were simply washed away by progress. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, know this: you are not defined by the moment you had to let go. You are defined by the moment you choose to hold on. Redemption is not a thunderclap. It is a quiet decision, a steady hand, a loyal friend who refuses to let you walk alone. May God bless you and keep you. Share this story if it spoke to you, and subscribe for more tales of faith and second chances.